Hi there, and welcome to the Language Gym. This is our fifth episode in our series of professional development quickies, short bouts of professional development in which I share tips about language pedagogy. And in this particular episode, totally unscripted and unrehearsed, but if a few slides here and there, I will talk to you about verbs. Why have I chosen the topic of verbs? Because I believe a lot of traditional practices actually clash with the way the brain acquires languages. I think they're often quite counterproductive. We often hear kids saying that they hate verbs, they find them very difficult, and you will see that teachers spend a lot of time drumming in conjugations. Very often we have to repeat the same conjugations over and over again. And even so, after 4 or 5 years of teaching, when the kids get to year 10 and 11, they still struggle, they still don't recall, and you still find yourself reteaching those verb conjugations over and over and over again. There are many reasons why verb conjugations are difficult. And one big problem as to why kids find verb conjugations difficult is because the verbs are often taught in isolation. Now, as you know, working memory has a very small processing capacity. We know that we can handle at any one time 3 or 4 items. So when you're thinking about the typical sentence revolves around the verb and its collocations and colligations. What does it mean? It means that the building block of any sentence a student has to produce is made up of 2 main elements: the verb, to go, to eat, to do, and the legal partnerships that the verb has with other words. Some of these partnerships will be legal, such as, for instance, to make tea or fast food. Some others are illegal. To do tea is not possible, although it is possible in French and Italian. And quick food is illegal. Fast and quick make the same thing, but you cannot put them together. So that's an example of a legal collocation. And a colligation refers to the pattern that glues the verb and what comes next. An example of a legal colligation, correct in the English language, is I want you to go. In French and Spanish, though, you'll say I want the you go. Translating literally in English what you do in Spanish and French will be illegal, will be incorrect, grammatically incorrect. So once you have the main building block sorted, the verb and what comes next, you basically have your sentence sorted. Yeah, I want you to go. Once you have that pattern correct, then all you have to do is add a time marker here. For instance, tomorrow I want you to go. Then a prepositional phrase, to the cinema. Maybe another one, with your brother, and maybe another one, at 5 o'clock. So as I mentioned in the previous quickie, when you see languages as a sort of Lego, where you are putting building blocks together and the kids master each of these building blocks, then you can see that processing languages and producing language is much easier. So instead of teaching verbs in isolation, the typical lists, whereby you're asking the students to perform a lot of operations. So first, retrieving the right verb, then working out what goes with it, conjugating the verb, thinking about what pattern binds them, then thinking about where the time marker goes, and then you're thinking about the preposition and what comes next. You are creating loads of demands on working memory, which unless the retrieval of that verb, its conjugation, and the pattern that binds with what follows, unless that's automatized, producing languages under time pressure, for instance, like in an exam or on the street of Paris, is going to be very arduous, very difficult, because there's so many demands. And of course, the brain at that point suffers from divided attention, especially if the verb is irregular, especially if the verb is not very familiar. And very often when we teach verbs in isolation, we presume that just because they practice the conjugation of AR verbs, so if we practice hablar loads of times, then if they're using trabajar, it's going to be the same. No, it's not. Because each time the brain is using a verb from the same conjugation, AR, ER, or IR, of a verb that they practiced before, they memorized before, like hablo, hablas, hablas, hablamos, habláis, hablan. It doesn't mean that they're going to do the same with every single verb in AR that they are going to use. This is a wrong assumption. The brain automatize each instance of the use of a specific verb. Doesn't automatize a paradigm. So each time the brain is using a new AR verb, they need to recall that paradigm, if you taught them that way, the paradigm of the present conjugation of hablar, and then transfer it to trabajar. That's why we need to make sure the kids use verbs through all full language skills. I'm going to go back to that point later, as many times as possible. That's how you automatize verb usage. So teaching verbs in isolation causes a higher, heavier cognitive load. A remedy to that instead is to teach that building block, so the verb and what comes after, from the very beginning, to model, in other words, a verb construction. And this can be done very easily through, for instance, my favorite tool for presenting language and vocabulary, which is basically the sentence builders. The advantage of sentence builders is to provide worked examples. So the students, instead of having to produce a sentence bottom up from single words that then have to glue together, the child is presented with a verb construction already. If you visualize my sentence builder, I'm going to show you one now, actually. You would have the verb with a wide range of options. So if you have leer, to read in Spanish, you will have un libro, tebeos, una novela, so all different possibilities, a book, comics, an article, a short story. This means that you are not only teaching verbs, what comes after, but you're also providing different choices. In other words, you're doing exactly what, for instance, Google does when you search a word, right? High frequency, all the high frequency words used with it usually appear in the search box of the Google search engine. Yeah, you look for leer, and all the different collocations and colligations of leer appear in the search box. I'll show you what a typical sentence builders looks like. For instance, I think I got a presentation here somewhere. This is totally unscripted, guys. That's why you can see all these little glitches in my presentation. There's an example of a sentence builder on modal verbs. As you can see, the verbs vouloir, pouvoir, and devoir are presented in context. The vouloir has quite a few verbs, infinitives with their own little collocation and colligation, aller à la piscine, aller au cinéma. And this construction is very straightforward. You have a time marker, something like, today I want to, and you got the hobbies, go to the swimming pool, but I can't because I must help my mother at home, for instance. So the whole idea is providing students with constructions. This is a quite straightforward one, but you can actually, when you're working with your 10s and 11s in the English system, so 14 and 15, 16-year-old, you can work with the more complex ones, which might have a concessive like bien que, although I must do my homework, I'm going to go out anyway. So the whole idea is that when you present constructions, you are providing work examples which help the students produce language more easily. And imagine bombarding your students with these constructions over two lessons, for instance. You are basically already sensitizing the students through this constant bombarding, through listening and reading with these constructions, sensitizing the learners to them, teaching them implicitly by sheer exposure. And when the child is then going to produce that construction, all they will have to worry about is the conjugation of the verb, because everything else is sorted. This easifies learning big time. But Gianfranco, how do I then move to the other persons of the verb? Very simple. You will have introduced another sentence builder. Let me show, I think I've got another example there. For instance, here I have an example of something for a book that we are writing at the moment, which is using modeling the verb to be in Spanish. So you have family members, and the pattern you're modeling to absolute beginners is I am tall, you're so tall, but short, good, slim, ugly, whatever, and describing a family member. Why am I starting only with the two persons? That's the other issue that I want to highlight. I'm only starting with the first two persons of the verb because our main concern at the beginning is to drill in their construction, making sure the students have actually automatized their construction. I will spend usually about 4 lessons on this. The first lesson is when you model it through a sentence builder, which all occurs through listening, by the way, very important, with a lot of games, a lot of activities, engaging, gamified, which basically produce a lot of exposure to this pattern. Once I believe the students have completely memorized that pattern and as many of the words in the sentence builder as possible, after 2 lessons through listening and reading, I will move to what I call force output. I'm going to talk about that later. So the students have the chance now to produce those chunks in speaking and writing through loads and loads of retrieval practice. When the students are then, when I feel they're ready, I got evidence in the, usually about, I would say the 4th, 5th lesson on that sentence builder, that the students have actually memorized that pattern. They completely embedded that in their long-term memory. Then what I do, I then move to, I need to find it, sorry. I move to the other persons on the verb. There you go. This is a sentence builder, the same sentence builder, but no, it's not the one. This is the one, with all the persons of the verb. And as you can see, I also added the plural. So now it's not just I am tall, or he is tall, or she is tall. I added also somos, so is son, all the plural forms of the verb too. At this point, I am sure that my pattern is more generative in terms of power, because the child now can actually talk about all their family members in all persons, I to they. So this is key, because one of the big problems that kids actually encounter in learning verbs is not being able to perform all the permutations and to put all the sentences that they're trying to produce together, because they simply don't have the tools. They don't have this framework into which slot all the words they need. So single words teaching makes sense when the student has actually automatized these patterns. So if I learned, for instance, I just say, I cannot go to the cinema because I have to study, then, it's pretty easy to use at that point the typical traditional ways of teaching conjugations, because at that point all that matters is slotting the different person of the verb in that construction. I don't believe in teaching any words in isolation, but with verbs, it is a must that you shouldn't. And a little spin-off of this kind of view of language, learning, verbs in isolation, as if they were some sort of discrete item that the students can then use at will as they speak, without having automatized the patterns, is teaching, for instance, verbs through acronyms or through songs or through gestures. Now, when you teach verbs through acronyms, something like, for instance, a typical Mrs. Van der Tramp in French that is widely used by teachers around the world, at least in the Anglo-Saxon system, to teach the verbs that form the perfect tense with être, you are basically dooming students for the rest of their careers as French students to constantly retrieve that acronym each time they are producing a perfect tense with être. That's a big issue. Imagine a student having to, under an exam, to produce a sentence with the verb sortir, mourir, or any other verbs, and thinking, is it one of the verbs on the Van der Tramp acronym? And of course, that's going to slow down fluency, because you are basically now using working memory, consciousness to retrieve that acronym and thinking, okay, is mourir one of them? And the same happens with songs. Songs are great, they're fun, don't get me wrong. However, what is the big problem with that? That each time a student is now producing verbs in real time, they need to access the lyrics of that song. That is going to make it much slower. So if a song and the Mrs. Van der Tramp are just a strategy, just a starting point, then it's okay. But if it becomes their sole or their main strategy to recall verbs, that's going to be a bit of a problem when they speak. When they're writing is a bit different. You have more time writing at home. And writing under exam condition, of course, it's the same. And we need to be aware of the role of consciousness in speaking. Consciousness is good, can be good at the beginning of the process. But remember, you want to make sure that the kids are fluent in the use of verbs or of any other words. That's why when you're producing worked examples, when you're giving the sentence builder to them, and verbs are learned in context, they are going to be more efficient because they are recalling bigger portions of language, chunked, and when you look at the sentence builder, let's look at it again. Let me share the screen. When you look at this again, you will see something, another big advantage of sentence builders, that because the words, the verb to be is not learned in isolation, but in context, in meaningful sentences, and especially if you will have a stage, and you will if you follow my approach, where the students are using those verbs and those adjectives in the performance of real life tasks, so tasks which are actually meaningful, which have a communicative justification and purpose, then you're providing the students and the human brain with more retrieval cues. We know that the more associations you create between the target items and other knowledge, other words, other concepts, the more association you create, the greater retention you realize. And of course, at retrieval, when the student is recalling those verbs, they have loads of hooks, loads of cues which will facilitate recall. So another advantage of sentence builders and of teaching verbs in context rather than those abstract paradigm is the fact that it facilitates retrieval. Of course, You need to stage loads of retrieval practice, which is the point I'm going to make later. Another very important point, another big issue, is that most of the time verbs are taught through the written medium, usually reading and writing. There's nothing wrong with that. However, if you want a student to be fluent, if you want a student to really, truly acquire verbs, they need to be practiced across all 4 skills. Yes, it takes more time. That's why I always say less is more. That's why I always say that you need to spend more time to make sure that you work on acquisition, not on coverage. And if you want to acquire verbs, you need to practice verbs through listening and reading. One of my mantras is that before students go to production, they need to have received loads of exposure through listening and reading. Number 1, because it's easier. Number 2, because we know extensive reading, extensive listening, they sensitize students to the patterns, they prime learning. So that when the students go to production, that constant work through listening and reading will facilitate production, cognitive load. Now, why is it important to do loads of listening in French, for instance? Because in French, as I'm sure you're aware, the pronunciation of words, the ability to decode words, both as we listen and as we read aloud, will make a big difference in terms of the accurate learning of the grammar. Why? Because in French, Spanish, Italian, German, the grammar of verbs depends on understanding the ending. Unless we hear the ending correctly, we are not going to learn the grammar in French. Why? Because, as you know, the distance between the way languages like French are pronounced, read aloud, and the actual print, so the spelling to sound correspondence, what in applied linguistics we call GPC, grapheme phoneme correspondence, the distance is huge. The V-E-U-X is pronounced with a silent X. Ils regardent, ils veulent, ils aiment is pronounced with a silent ENT. And what do a lot of students do? They pronounce, for instance, ils regardent, ils regardent. And of course, that is huge implications for learning. Because if you keep having the impression that they watch, ils regardent is pronounced ils regardons, when you hear it, you not be able to recognize it. And when you speak it, you might be misunderstood by the listener, especially a French native speaker with not much empathy. We need to be aware then of the importance, for instance, when we teach French verbs, to focus them on phonological processing, making sure that when you teach verbs, you do a lot of work on silent letters. So activities of mine that I normally do with sentence builders, like spot the silent letter. So when you say je veux, it will spot the X. Minimal pairs. For instance, you could get je veux, which means I want, for those who don't speak French, et nous voulons, the pronunciation of ou, the versus ou, for instance. Playing games like faulty echo, when you pronounce a word correctly, je veux, and then you say wrongly, faulty echo, je veux, and they need to spot what the difference is. So all these phonological awareness activities are key and are often not done. That's one of the limitations, for instance, of learning only through worksheets, or practicing and testing grammar only through gap fill activities, for instance. So there's nothing wrong in doing this kind of activities, which I'm sure you will all be familiar with. Let me share the screen again. So activities like this, they're not, I don't know why it keeps doing that. yeah, activities like this, gap fills, are not bad, don't get me wrong, but they should be seen as the starting point. So this is something that is your absolute beginning in a sequence. After you will have done all the work, of course, on the kind of work on listening that I just mentioned, and much more. You'll find in my book and on my blog loads of activities. And if you go on my TES account, the Times Educational Supplement, www.ts.co.uk or .com, you'll find loads of activities which have my sentence builders and listening games and activities you can perform with them to raise this phonological awareness, which is absolutely paramount in French, and not just in French, even in Italian. For instance, very often in native English speakers of Italian, when they pronounce the certain vowels, they mix them up. For instance, the dice, lui dice, which is he says, very often is pronounced by kids lui dici, but dici is actually the second person, whereas lui dice is the third person of the verb. Just to tell you how the subtleties in terms of problems in listening comprehension, phonological processing, can actually affect grammar learning, verb learning in this case. So if you want the students to be fluent, to be actually to have proceduralized, learned verbs, it is absolutely imperative that you have loads of listening and reading before they go to production, and that you involve all 4 language skills. So stay longer on verbs. Now, another big problem, of course, is the forgetting rate. Yeah, we know from the famous Ebbinghaus Curve, which I think I have here somewhere. I think it'll be worth having a look at it, if I can find it. So I'm going to press for current slide, see if it works. I don't know why it's not working. The Zoom is not the best thing to use, I don't think. Okay, so this is the Ebbinghaus curve. The Ebbinghaus curve shows you clearly how easy it is to forget. And this curve is very much what we call the power law of practice curve as well. What we know from skill acquisition is that at one point, the learning is quite strong. You see, when you get by between point 30 and 20, you can see the curve is flattening, and the kids are making fewer mistakes in recalling. They retrieve most of the material that you taught quite well. But at that point, as you can see, so after about 2 days, when the curve starts to flatten, that's where you have to keep at practicing whatever you've been teaching, because this is where forgetting is likely to happen. So at the beginning, teachers get reassured that their students have learned, because, within the first 6 days, quite a lot of forgetting happens, and it gets worse as you approach the end of a month since first learning. So this is where your practice must happen. Unfortunately, verbs are usually taught. The teacher may spend maybe a couple of lessons or 3 on that verb. And then because of this anxiety, the fact that we have to cover a lot of materials, what happens is that you may move on to another set of verbs or another set of nouns, something else, another topic sometimes. So it's very important that you recycle constantly. And recycling is something which is often paid lip service to, but is not often done. I review loads of curricula when I go to schools to help them out with their curriculum design. And of course, I worked in many schools over 28 years of profession. And of course, I have also shared with colleagues loads of teach meets and meetings. And what I often see is not much recycling. This is important. I'll give an example, for instance, of what Dylan this time, Dylan Viñales and I are doing. We are producing a book full of sentence builders, narrow readings, and all the kind of activities that we use to support EPI. So this is going to be the reading and writing bit of EPI, of course, not the listening and speaking, as you know, is crucial. And if you want to know more about listening and speaking, do get my book, Breaking the Sound Barrier. See, I'm plugging my stuff again. When you look at here, you will see, for instance, how the verb ser is recycled in, this is a working document, is the table of content of a book. The first half is like another page of content. You can see how ser is first taught in the topic of family, then after describing physical appearance, then again after talking about jobs, then again when describing clothes, then again later on. And in the second half of the table of content, ser is recycled 3 or 4 times more until the end of the course. So this is an example of how you can plan. And you can see also the same with hacer, jugar, ir in blue. Yeah, they all recycled many times over. Why? Because one of the most important aspects of forgetting is what we call cue-dependent forgetting. What does it mean? It means the memory is context-dependent. So unless you give the students the chance to revisit that vocabulary in different linguistic contexts, different semantic contexts, forgetting will happen. So the practice of using the same Quizlet or the same, I don't know, memorize or even language gym activity, the same activity for the same vocabulary many times over, that is still recycling, but it's less powerful than recycling like this, where the same verbs is now coupled, married, interwoven with different words from different topics. This is in accordance with the principle of TAP, transfer appropriate processing, which means that when you learn something in a context, is not necessarily transferred to another. And this principle says something else, which is very important, which goes back to what I said to you earlier about the importance of learning verbs through all 4 modalities, listening, reading, speaking, and writing. That is the fact that transfer doesn't occur from modality to modality very often. We know from research that what you learn through listening is not necessarily going to be transferred to writing or reading or speaking. So it's very important that recycling is not just about revisiting the vocabulary, but revisiting the vocabulary across contexts. I'll give an example from, for instance, the sentence builder I showed you earlier. So here, the verb ser was used with adjectives. Here, here is used with adjectives. Here is used in the same booklet with jobs, for instance. And you will find that there will be other sentence builders where ser is recycled with clothes, with the description of pets, description of furniture. That means that the children have loads of opportunities to practice that in different combinations, which goes for stronger learning. So you can see the difference. There are some Ofsted inspectors that say, I want to forge linguists, not language learners. And what they will do, they will get the students to recite those paradigms over and over and over again in isolations. My approach is completely different. Give them loads of retrieval cues by making sure that those verbs are not repeated in their heads hundreds of times or doing Quizlet or even my old verb trainer. No. They hear those verbs and they practice those verbs in many combinations with different words from different contexts, in different tenses, in different communicative situations. The next point I want to make to you is about the issue of fluency. Now, fluency is the most important thing. Those silly gap fills, I mean, and they're not silly, they can be quite useful actually to develop collocations and collocations, absolutely. But those gap fills The big problem with those gap fills is that are not often used just to model or to drill verbs. They're often used to test, as if when a student does one of those and gets like 100% or 90%, they've acquired those verbs. And that's absolutely false. Doing a gap fill with the infinitive in brackets or even a translation, which is a bit better, doesn't assure that the students have fluent recall in real operating conditions. What Keith Johnson, in his famous book in 1996, called ROC, Real Operating Conditions. ROC means in real life experiences. When there is a challenge which could be affective, for instance, when you're stressed under exam conditions, and what do the kids always say in those conditions? J'ai joué au foot, je suis allé au McDo, je suis allé au cinéma, j'ai mangé une pizza. Yeah, and this is typical. And the reason why they do that is because, of course, under exam conditions, under pressure, your brain performs less. So it goes for what is safer. And what is safer for kids in England, at least, or in the English system, to say when it comes to verbs? The verb collocations with manger, je mange une pizza, je mange des frites. With boire, to drink, je bois un coca. With aller, je vais au cinéma, je vais au McDo, and things, collocations that they encountered loads and loads of times. This already gives you a clue about the importance of teaching chunks, but also the importance of loads and loads of practice. Kids always say, j'ai joué au foot, je suis allé au McDo. And very often they say that because they're given the choice when they do the little surveys or the little interview practice or speed dating, where, you know, of course, they haven't got much time to think. They haven't received a lot of practice in a wide range of chunks. So they come out with the easier thing to say. And we need to win them off this habit through effective teaching. And Centers Builder help because they offer a wide range of collocations and colligation. So how do we achieve fluency? I already gave you quite a few pointers so far. Well, the most important thing, of course, for fluency and spontaneity is the kids practice verbs across all 4 language skills. We already covered that. The second prerequisite is, of course, that these are revisited many times over regular intervals until they automatize it. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very important that we intervene when the curves start to flatten. When the curve of skill acquisition, which is basically reflective of the power law of practice, when it starts to flatten, that's where you need to intervene and make sure that you don't stop. What most teachers do, as I wrote in my last blog, is that they often, when they are assured the students can recall, when they're assured they make fewer mistakes in carrying out a task, they stop. Actually, that's where you have to start. Once the students are confident with recall, you need to keep going until they automatize those verbs, so that you don't have to go back to them in year 10 and 11 all over again, which is tedious for you, which is tedious for the kids, and which unfortunately prevents you from covering other things. So alongside the fact that you should practice a lot across all 4 skills and all the recycling and interleaving, which we talked about, there is the issue, of course, of making sure the kids use the verbs for a real life purpose. It's important. We learn things when we use them for a meaningful purpose. We are goal-orientated individuals, humans. And the minute you just learn paradigms and conjugations, you are not doing that, because it's completely in abstract, has no meaning. And today's kids, they don't tend to learn things just for learning's sake. They need to see a purpose. That's why my curriculum design is based on communicative functions rather than just topics. Another very important thing, sorry, I silenced my phone because it's starting to bug me. Another very important prerequisite of fluency is the ability to have fluent recall under real operating conditions. Yeah, on the street of Paris, or under exam pressure, as I mentioned earlier. And that requires planning. If you want your student to be fluent with verbs, well, with everything else, you need to have a sort of pedagogic framework. In another quickie, I'm going to talk to you about the principles. Now I'll tell you very schematically the phases in my teaching of verbs. First, I present them through a sentence builder in a construction in the first or second person. Why the first or second person? Well, it goes back to the principle of phonological and orthographic similarity. What does it mean? We know that when we learn, we voice everything we read, even if we read it silently, everything we say, everything we hear. It's all mediated by sound. What happens in working memory is that this loop that scientists call the articulatory loop in a Badley and Hitch model of working memory, find it difficult to learn, to memorize things when they are very similar in sound and spelling. Sound creates much more interference than spelling. And in French, but in any Romance languages, when you learn in conjugations, if you're not a stickler for detail, passionate, gifted linguists, you will have problems, because we know that conjugations in this language are extremely similar. Hence, they interfere with each other. They cause a phenomenon called cross associations, where you don't know which one is which because they sound so similar. So you will listen to Spanish fue and fui, and they are very similar, aren't they, fue and fui? And especially when you hear them pronounced fast, hence the importance at the beginning of really enunciating endings when you're presenting verbs, using what we call input enhancement. We need to ensure that when you are introducing verb conjugation, you introduce them not as the whole paradigm to start with, unless you have extremely talented kids, but you break it down. And you would start with one or two, as I showed you in my sentence builder, choosing usually things which are fairly noticeable, differences. For instance, in French, an obvious one would be the first person, for instance, je joue, and the first person plural, jouons, which are very different. Or in the case again of French, because je joue and elle joue are completely identical. Je, elle joue, you could actually use them, making sure that you emphasize the je and the joue, and the je and the il or elle, making sure that it's clear to them what the pronouns means, because pronouns in French, of course, make all the difference. Unlike Spanish, where you need to focus on the endings because it's all play there. They don't have any pronouns. Juego, juegas, juega. You need to pay attention to the pronouns. With French, the issue is more difficult, because what does the brain do? The brain focuses on what's in front. And if you are teaching je joue, tu joues, il joue, they don't really need to pay attention to the ending, do they? They can just simply pay attention to the pronoun. That makes it more difficult for kids to learn conjugation. That je, tu, il helps understanding, but penalizes the learning of endings. That's why you need to do a lot of work on creating that learned attention I mentioned in the previous video, making sure that we teach the Anglo-Saxon brain to do something which is not very natural for it, which is to pay attention at the different endings. As I said, in English, you only have one ending per tense, more or less. Yeah, you got the ed for regular verbs in the simple past. You got the s in the third person singular of the present in the present of verbs. So when you're teaching French, this phonological similarity, which causes interference, is compounded by this masking effect that the fronting of the pronoun creates. This means that you need to do an extra effort focus on spelling to print correspondence. There's games I mentioned earlier with the faulty echo, but also dictations, for instance, when you gap the ending of verbs, or anagrams, any other little activities and games which focus them on the printed to sound correspondence. We go back to fluency now. We kind of diverted from fluency. So fluency is about having control over all these factors and to work on making sure that the students can recall things fluently in context as they perform a real life task. You have to plan for it. I'll share with you my sort of framework. So I will start, let me share this. Today is the first quickie where I actually share things. So you will start with your sentence builders. So let's get that sentence builder that we had on models. Yeah, here it is. So you will start with your sentence builder. There we go, the one on the model verbs. You will make sure that you'll do a lot of practice with listening and reading, all my reading aloud games, all my listening as modeling tasks, narrow reading, narrow listening. You sensitize the student to this construction. You drilled in the single words through games like my boxing game or my vocabulary building quickies. In other words, the kids now have 2 lessons, maybe even 3, but 2 is ideal, where you have done loads of receptive practice. Remember, extensive receptive practice before production. You will then make sure that you do what I call structured production. In this phase, what you're going to do basically is a lot of structured, highly structured drills where the students in very extremely controlled and highly structured and prompted and scaffolded information gap tasks and other games, you do what I call forced output. In other words, you make sure that the kids say absolutely everything you want them to say with that verb, so that they don't just limit themselves to one collocation, like je joue au foot or je vais au McDo, but they are forced through craftily designed drills to say absolutely every single verb and what comes next as many times as possible. Why? Because you want them to become confident in recalling those chunks, and you focus only on the first or second person. But this is classics, right? Very simple picture task activity. This is an information gap. Imagine that there is a mother and a child. Partner 1 is the child. Partner 2 is the mother and has this schedule. The partner 1 is going to ask, Mommy, can I want to play football with my friends. Can I play football from 4 to 5? And Mom says, sorry, Johnny, but you must help me. Of course, all in the target language. Tu dois aider ta mère. Can I play PlayStation between 8 and 9? Not sorry, you have to have dinner. Can I play PlayStation between 7 and 8? Yes, you are free. So it's just a typical information gap activity. But I prefer more highly structured things. Why? I prefer translation games. I wrote a blog about that. Why? Because you really can control what they're going to say to the T, to the uttermost detail. How? Because the translation forces, of course, them to say exactly what you want. This is what I call no snake, no ladders. It's the game that you play in 3, where the kids are challenging each other, 2 players, with translating those sentences. They're all graded in terms of difficulty. Task grading is paramount in realizing fluency. You would task grade all the time. You make sure that you go from easier to more difficult in an extremely gradual and staggered fashion, which means that very often you have to make your own activities because textbooks don't grade their tasks. And as the 2 players challenge each other, each time they don't know a sentence or make a mistake, the referee who has the list with all the answers will give them feedback. And You will have staged several rounds so that the two players can play with other players. The referee will be a referee, being the weaker kids. You will have chosen them to be a referee, so they get the input from the brighter kids. The referee will then eventually, when they are ready, play with other referees. So you have loads of exposure to input, loads of practice through reading aloud as they give the corrections, and of course there is a lot of fun involved in this too. Another game that I like, it's not really a game, this is what I call communicative drills or oral translation drills, where the kids are basically bullet points, could be two or more, of course, depending on the complexity. One person is partner A, the other one is going to be partner B, and they have to translate that in real time. You can give them a time limit with a referee, coach rather, being there at all times with the solution, a paper that you will prepare for them with the answer sheets, the answers on there. So the whole idea now here is to have the referee as a coach who gives them corrections. Of course, you will train them to do it in an empathetic kind of way. This is Fast and Furious, another game which this time, you see, involves a gap fill, but in a different kind of way. Again, you have two players and the referee. The kids need to read that as fast as they can, conjugating the verbs in brackets as fast as they can in whatever tense you decided they should do that into. And the whole point is for them to beat the others in terms of speed. So partner A will say it really fast. The referee will time them. Partner B will say it really fast. They will time them. They'll write down on in their exercise books what the time was. And even if partner A loses, no worries. They will have a chance to do the same Fast and Furious game with that sheet of a very similar one with the same verbs, because you want to realize transfer. So you will prepare 3 or 4 of those. And the whole idea is from time 1 to time 4 or 5, every learner who succeeds in saying it faster will be rewarded and will be the winner. So everyone really usually wins, because from time 1 to time 5, they have routinized the verbs. And if you do this before the Fast and Furious, you stage a verb training session using my verb trainer on my website, which you will see in the second part of this video, which I've already uploaded. You will understand how that will facilitate this game and bring it to the next level. There are other translation games, oral translation games that are staged, like for instance, oral ping pong and fluency cards, all centered around the idea that there is a desirable difficulty. In other words, it's highly structured, but there is an added challenge. And the other challenge brings me to the next point, automatization. So this kind of activities create a desirable difficulty by making them work to a time limit, by increasing the pressure because of the competition. And we know that this enhances learning. Yeah, desirable difficulties is a concept originated in Professor Bjork, where we know that when the brain has this kind of emotional or cognitive challenge feasible, so within the zone of proximal development, it does 2 things. If they succeed, it enhances self-efficacy, can-do attitude, and 2, it enhances learning. It's a bit akin to what we do in sports with athletes, right? First they run, they get maybe 11.20 in the 100 meters run, and then you say, right, now I'm going to put ankles around your weights. Now you have to run uphill. Of course, you wouldn't put huge weights, you put something they can do. And this added constraints, challenges, of course, push them even further still within that zone of proximal development, to quote Vygotsky. And we know that when they manage to perform the task, complete the task successfully in that zone, they develop what's called effectance, a feeling of effectance, develops resilience, develops self-esteem, develops self-efficacy. So it enhances learning that way. But also means that when you remove those weights and when they stop running uphill, but they go back to a flat ground, they will run faster. So the same concept applies here. So first, you present the vocabulary, the pattern through your sentence builder. Then you expose them to masses and masses and masses of input, recycling over and over again the same patterns with various types of vocabulary. Like, for instance, my narrow reading sequence in a previous video has shown you. Once the students have consolidated the knowledge of the verbs receptively, so they've done a lot of recognition of verbs through listening or writing, you can do activities like, for instance, spot the error. Yeah, when they have a sentence with a verb, you may have 10 sentences, 5 are correct, 5 contain the wrong form of the verbs and they need to tweak it and correct it. Activities like where they're supposed to match what the verb they hear to the translation in English that is written down. Activities like faulty transcript, activities like those interactive reading aloud games that I always talk about, like sentence stealer. So anything that sensitizes the students to the patterns and the verbs that you are teaching. The third stage will be fluent recall, the structured drills that I mentioned about. They could be highly structured from English into the target language, or they could be structured information gaps like the ones I showed you, picture tasks or people having different information to share with each other, or it could be tasks that you design carefully based on the principle of task uniqueness. What does it mean? Task uniqueness means that your task will elicit exactly the kind of structure that you're trying to drill in. The typical role plays with prompts in the target language that you find in the GCSE examination in England, for instance, is an example of its task uniqueness. It cues very clearly the student to the use of what they're supposed to say. And after this stage, you will then focus, or you reach lesson 5 or 6, you will have taught now the full conjugation. Now you need to plan for automaticity. I'm going to talk about that phase in another video, but the whole idea is that you will have recycled in your schemes of learning the key verbs, the core verbs, the ones that you definitely want your student to learn over and over and over again. You will have then made sure that your students know, that all of your students master now. They can recall like that the chunks and the verbs that you taught, and I'm going to give you in the next video some tools, interactive with instant feedback, which the students can use on their own independently in these days of remote learning, extremely handy. And then you will stage towards the end of the unit, at the end of term, and throughout each subunit. I will explain that in my CPT quickies later on, but I wrote about that in a couple of blog posts, my 2 last blog posts on the Language Gym blog. You will stage fluency training, where those verbs are now used for real life purposes in the context of real life tasks. This is the phase in my Mars Years pedagogic framework, which refer to spontaneity, the development of spontaneity. Those verbs are nothing if they can just be recalled quickly in structured drills. We need to make sure that over a long period of time, these verbs are used meaningfully for a real life purpose, or the kids will forget them because they're not relevant to them, unless they are this able linguist, the 2 or 3 that we're going to carry on and go on to A levels and university, 2 languages that become basically teachers like us. We need to be empathetic, understand that we need to reduce cognitive load. We need to gamify, you know, those games that I showed you with chunks. Another blogger calls it grammar race. This person has a tendency to change all of my activities and call them something else, which is good. That's what inspiring others is about. But the whole idea is gamifying learning with younger learners in a meaningful way, meaningful play. There is a rationale behind it. Those games that I showed you push the input you planted in the head out. So those verbs are now used in the context of high frequency sentences, chunks, and the teacher is not present. Yeah, you may go around hovering and kind of asking each referee, how did he go, just to verify who is doing what and how well. But the main idea is this phase of retrieval of verbs is totally student-led, and most importantly, because you have a referee, with the answers, the student get instantaneous feedback. That doesn't happen with a worksheet. The kids do their little gap fill, they give it to you, they get it back 3-4 days later, or even longer. By that time, it doesn't have any meaning to them anymore. So gamification, which is meaningful and provides instant feedback, and loads of recycling, is highly conducive to verb. And you can see the difference between this way of teaching verbs with a plan, presentation, modeling, loads of input, explanation of how conjugation works, loads of practice, retrieval practice, and then fluency in spontaneous context, which I'll deal in a different quickie, how different it is from a gap fill, and testing students with the gap fills. Students can't be tested with a gap fill only. That says, yes, at the beginning stage, they have routinized the conjugation. Now we need to hit the curve when it flattens, when forgetting happens. Remember, after 31 days, 75% of what the students have learned is gone. After 6 days, about 70, but scarily after 1 hour, 60% more or less of what they learned is gone. So I hope that you got some tips. Sorry if it felt a little bit chaotic, but as I told you, this is completely unscripted. Luckily, I had some slides from a webinar that I'm preparing. If you want to see the proper scientific, academic, scripted Gianfranco, do join the webinar. Do get a hold of my book. Do follow me on Twitter at Gianfranco Conti, Gianfranco Cont9. Read my blog, The Language Gym. And most importantly, the session 2 on the topics of verb will tell you loads more. It will recap the main points here and tell you how you can do more or less all of this on the language gym. Of course, you can't do listening yet, but I promise you, and this is the big thing happening on the language gym very soon, we're going to have a whole section of listening as modeling, which focuses on verbs from all these angles, the phonological processing, lexical retrieval, parsing, and all the other things that I told you about in the previous CPD quickies and in the current one. Thank you for sticking out all to the end of this video. It was pretty long. So much for being a quickie, and I hope this was useful. I'll see you on this channel for part 2 and the rest. Stay safe. All the best.